is the story of what happens to the world we leave behind. In this episode of Life After People, the relentless power of water. It threatens to wipe out everything in its path and erase mankind's greatest masterpieces. But why will this abandoned mining colony hold off water's destructive effects and outlast Earth's greatest cities? And how will the river of oil flowing through the Alaska pipeline break free? Welcome to Earth. Population zero. Man has always struggled to hold back and harness the raw power of water. On a planet where more than 70% of the surface is covered by oceans, lakes, and rivers, it's a never-ending battle. Now, man is gone, and along the planet's more than 220,000 miles of coastline and millions of miles of waterways, a raging force is ready to break free. One day after people. In the California state capital of Sacramento, where an action hero once came to preside over the 8th largest economy in the world, there is about to be a watery disaster big enough to rival any Hollywood blockbuster. In 2005, the world saw water's devastating effects when Hurricane Katrina's storm surge overpowered man-made levees, destroying much of New Orleans. And Sacramento has many of the same vulnerabilities. Every winter and spring, heavy rains and runoff from melting snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains turn the rivers in low-lying Sacramento into deadly torrents.
We're standing at the confluence of the American River and the Sacramento River. And these two rivers, particularly in this area, are entirely encased by levees, which are placed right against the river. And that's why Sacramento is the most at-risk large city in the United States.
But raging water isn't the only villain in this developing disaster. There are thousands of accomplices already working to make the impending disaster bigger.
Rodents are the nemesis of levees out here. You have ground squirrels that make these networks of burrows, and the worst of them all is the beavers.
In 2008, animal tunnels were believed to be one of the main causes of a levee failure in the town of Fernley, Nevada, near Reno. The raging waters flooded 600 homes and caused an estimated $4 million of damage. And Sacramento's levees share a dangerous flaw with those in Fernley. The earthen levees were originally built by farmers more than 100 years ago. Without repairs by human crews, it won't take long for the water to find a way through. Across the planet, in the Netherlands, more than a quarter of the country is below sea level. During the time of humans, 60% of the population, about 10 million people, lived in these vulnerable areas. Because of that threat, the Dutch built an amazingly advanced flood defense system. Now, the city of Rotterdam is empty. In the Boijmans Museum, works by Rembrandt, Van Gogh, and other Dutch masters worth millions of dollars still hang on the wall. But the less than 10 feet above sea level. And a massive storm surge barrier between Rotterdam and the North Sea holds the key to the city's survival. Days after People. Back in North America, the port of Valdez, Alaska is eerily quiet. In the time of humans, tankers came here to fill up with oil. The oil flowed 800 miles inside the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. If laid out in the lower 48, it would stretch from Chicago to Dallas. This man-made river of oil is pumped from Alaska's North Slope across 3 mountain ranges and 34 major rivers to holding tanks in Valdez. There are 380 million gallons of oil inside the pipeline at any given time.
At its peak, the pipeline was moving about 2 million barrels a day of oil down the pipeline. The production on the North Slope has declined considerably, so it's moving about 700,000 barrels a day down the line now.
The hum of the pump stations along the pipeline stops as their fuel and electricity runs out. But the gurgling sound of moving liquid can still be heard in Valdez. It's traveling from a storage tank several hundred feet in elevation above the waterline to one of the tankers below. It's here where the river of oil breaks free.
If the ship were loading, then it could continue to load. The tanks gravity feed down to the ship. So they would continue to run, and potentially one of the tanks on the ship would overflow.
Millions of gallons of black death drained into the harbor. The tens of thousands of birds and marine mammals near Valdez have witnessed this before. In 1989, the Exxon Valdez disaster happened a few miles offshore in Prince William Sound. About 11 million gallons spilled. Now, this overflowing tanker drowns the harbor with almost twice as much oil. But as hundreds of millions more gallons sit in the 800 miles of pipeline, another disaster awaits. 2,800 miles away, near Chicago, a dangerous fish is continuing its shocking invasion. In the time of humans, along vast stretches of the Mississippi River and its tributaries, the non-native Asian carp terrorized people by hurling themselves out of the water whenever boats came near.
We've heard many times about people being injured down on the Illinois River, broken jaws, broken clavicles, being knocked unconscious, knocked off their jet ski or personal watercraft. So yeah, these are really changing the way people are able to recreate on the rivers.
The plant-eating Asian carp were brought over from Asia beginning in the 1960s by catfish farmers looking for a cheap and safe way to keep their ponds clean. Then, the carp began escaping during floods in the 1980s and started heading north. Now they're making their way into the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, which leads to Lake Michigan. Man feared that if the carp made it into the Great Lakes, they would kill off the desirable fish by devouring their food supply. So it's here that mankind made its last stand against the Asian carp. Fish approaching this part of the canal are in for a nasty shock. A series of virtual fences built by the Army Corps of Engineers creates an an electric current in the water.
When a fish approaches, the further it goes into the barrier, the larger the electrical shock it feels, and at some point in time the fish realizes it's getting worse as I move forward, so it turns around and it goes back the way it came.
But once the power goes out, can anything stop the invasion of this jumping fish? One week after People, half a world away in Australia, sits one of the most iconic buildings on the planet, the Sydney Opera House. During the time of humans, the 4.5-acre building used as much electricity as a town of 25,000 people. The 160,000-ton building appears to float at the edge of the harbor, but is actually held up by 580 reinforced concrete pilings sunk up to 82 feet below sea level. The Opera House hosted about 3,000 events a year. But now, there is just one final long-running show, the slow decay of the building itself. The salty water of Sydney Harbour causes the most damage. It attacks the reinforced concrete pilings. The most vulnerable area for the pilings is known as the splash zone.
In the splash zone, where you have repeated wet-dry cycles, the worst conditions are present because you have the sulfates attacking the cement paste on the outside, and you have chlorides that are coming in contact with oxygen to help get the corrosion of steel going on.
The building is best known for its iconic roof. For now, the soaring ceramic tile-covered shells at the top of the Opera House are well sealed from the salty harbor air. But a design feature that made these elegantly curved shapes possible now holds the secret to their future. 1 week after People, outside this nondescript building along the Industrial Canal near Chicago, emergency generators have kept the electric barriers buzzing. But now, the generators have consumed their last drop of fuel. For the Asian carp, the pathway to the Great Lakes seems wide open. In the coming days, they will begin heading toward Chicago and a vast new feeding ground in Lake Michigan. A week after People, the relentless power of water is just beginning to take a toll on the world's most famous buildings. But this rogue force can also strike quickly, threatening to plunge an entire city underwater. One month after People, coastlines around the world have gone dark. Moonlight casts an eerie glow over the oceans. But in the surf off Los Angeles, strange lights twinkle in the sea. On the Santa Monica Pier, the Ferris wheel still blazes with 160,000 LED lights. First installed in 2008, they flash with computer-controlled designs that can be seen from more than 10 miles away.
The Ferris wheel on the Santa Monica Pier is run on solar power, and as long as those solar panels are active, it can keep powering those LED lights.
But now that People are gone, how long will the light show last? And how long will the pier be able to withstand the relentless pounding of the waves? In the Netherlands, evidence of people's long struggle to control water is all around. From small levees and quaint windmills to massive coastal barriers. The largest barriers, some equipped with huge metal metal storm surge gates were built after a devastating flood in 1953.
In that one storm in 1953, there were 2,000 people that drowned. There was about 10,000 buildings that were flooded and damaged. Tremendous amount of devastation to the infrastructure.
Rotterdam is one of the most vulnerable Dutch cities. Near the city center, priceless works by Rembrandt and Van Gogh hang in the Boijmans Museum just a few feet above sea level. In the time of humans, two massive floodgates protected the city by shutting out any storm surges from the North Sea. They're some of the largest moving structures on Earth. Each gate is 70 feet high and almost 700 feet long. They're connected to enormous ball joints by steel trusses that are so massive that it's almost as if two Eiffel Towers had been re-engineered to move the mammoth gates. But as a new storm slams ashore, the gates sit idle. Rotterdam fills with water from two directions.
The rivers are flowing to the North Sea, and the surge is raising up the elevation of the water in the North Sea, and so what's coming down has no place to go, and it just continues to raise higher and higher.
Water infiltrates the museum and washes away some of mankind's greatest cultural treasures. After People. Near Chicago, the electric barrier keeping the Asian carp out of Lake Michigan is gone. In the time of humans, the carp seriously injured people by panicking and jumping out of the water anytime boats came by. Now, the electric barrier has been gone for almost a year. And yet, the marine invaders still haven't taken over the lake. There are other man-made barriers blocking their way to the Great Lakes, the largest freshwater system in the world. The main one is the Chicago Harbor Lock, designed to let boats pass while keeping the Chicago River from flowing into Lake Michigan. Two sets of gates reach all the way to the bottom, 35 feet below.
The lock gates are 71 years old and they're just made out of steel, riveted steel. Below the water line, the lock gates are in a very stable environment. They're in fresh water, so they tend to be in fairly good shape. Roughly below the water line, going up past the water line, exposed to the air, are the parts that tend to corrode a lot.
The invaders are turned back at the gates. For now. 3 years after People. In Sacramento, there's no action movie star to come to the rescue. The city is on the verge of a blockbuster disaster. Without maintenance, the earthen levees are threatening to burst. A neighborhood south of downtown known as the Pocket is especially vulnerable.
In this neighborhood of Sacramento, the houses are extremely close to the levee. In some places, they're right up against the levee on one side. We don't have much land on the water side, so the water is right up against the levee on the other side.
But as the river level rises during a winter rainstorm, the first signs of water come not from above, but below.
One way that levees can fail is if water seeps underneath the levee. And the land in this area has a much coarser material under the levee that allows water to seep through very easily.
Water bubbles builds up near the homes. Without maintenance crews to shore up the weak spots, disaster suddenly strikes.
It actually lubricates the area underneath the levee and makes a material that it can slide on. And the entire levee in that section could actually slide landward. We would have such a massive amount of water flowing through very quickly that the houses near that would be completely wiped out and ripped from their foundations.
In other areas of Sacramento, water overtops the levees. Breaches quickly spread. North of downtown, Sacramento's airport is inundated by more than 10 feet of water.
So you come out to the airport after this flood where everybody's disappeared. The water would be up to the wings, over the wings of the airplanes. I mean, you might see the tails sticking out.
The downtown area is more elevated, but there's still about 5 feet of water surrounding the state capitol. For the dogs that have managed to survive the first 3 years after people, this new water world presents a deadly challenge for those with certain physical traits. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina killed or left homeless an estimated 600,000 animals, including thousands of dogs. Many of the dogs were trapped inside houses which flooded. For those with short limbs and barrel chests, the chances of survival were very slim.
A good example of this would be the bulldog. They have oversized heads and chests, and they're a flat-faced dog with a reduced respiratory system. So it's very unusual for a bulldog to exercise in long distances or swim for long distances.
Now, with most of Sacramento underwater, mixes of retrievers, labs, and other well-proportioned swimming dogs adapt to the city's repeated floods. Other specialized breeds have been wiped out. But 20 miles away, there's another watery disaster building in the foothills above Sacramento that threatens to deliver an even greater wave of devastation. After people, the non-native Asian carp is trying to enter Lake Michigan at the Chicago Harbor Lock. These fish were viewed as such a menace by mankind that in 2009, officials tried to eradicate them by pouring poison into the canal where they lived, enough to kill 200,000 pounds of fish. Now, if these invaders can make it past the 133-ton steel barriers, they may finally rule the largest freshwater system on the planet, the Great Lakes. And after several changes of season, a weakness in the very center of the lock gates is providing an opening.
The things that would probably break down first on our lock gates would be the rubber seals. Ice causes a lot of damage and actually rips the seals off without much of an effort at all.
Where the seals were, thousands of smaller carp now stream through the 6-inch gap and into the lake with its enormous new food supply. With each female capable of carrying 2.5 million eggs at a time, is there anything left on Earth that can stop this marauding invader? 4 years after people. In Sydney Harbour, near the Opera House, trouble is brewing for another engineering marvel. The Sydney Harbour Bridge, nicknamed the Coat Hanger by locals, is one of the tallest steel arch bridges in the world. It was made with the special ability to expand and contract. The bridge towers 430 feet above the harbor water, but in Australia's extreme heat, the steel arch expands to grow a foot taller during the day, shrinking back to size at night. After 4 years in the strong sun and salty air of Sydney Harbour, signs of corrosion are everywhere. And corrosion in one particular area could eventually doom this massive structure. This coat hanger has hinges to allow the bridge to grow taller. The hinges are at each end of the massive single arch. But corrosion may soon cause the hinges to lock together. What will happen if the bridge loses its ability to expand and contract? Back in Lake Michigan, a year after Asian carp began streaming in, they haven't taken over as expected. An ancient threat was waiting for them. The sea lamprey is a freakish-looking, jawless fish that attaches to its prey and sucks out their blood and other bodily fluids. It entered the Great Lakes when Lake Erie was connected to the St. Lawrence Seaway. During the time of humans, enormous efforts were made to keep the sea lamprey from devastating the sport fishing population.
Great Lakes Fishery Commission and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service currently spend about $16 to $19 million annually controlling the numbers of these fish. If that control went away, their numbers would increase greatly.
So instead of taking over the Great Lakes, the Asian carp come face to face with the sea lamprey. For years, people tried to control which types of fish thrived in these waters. But now, 2 species accidentally introduced by humans have taken over. After People. On the Pacific coast, the famous solar-powered Ferris wheel on Santa Monica Pier is still lighting up the night. During the day, the pounding the pier has taken over the years is showing. In the time of humans, maintenance crews constantly replace damaged deck planks.
10 years down the road, definitely see the deck deteriorate. We can have some sinking buildings. The elevation of those buildings sinking through the pier. Not all at once, but a corner here, a corner there, a side here, half of it there. And little by little, these buildings could basically just sink through the pier.
Then, finally, the nightly light show from the Ferris wheel comes to an end. The solar panels and most of the LED lights would be expected to last 20 to 25 years. But after a decade without maintenance, the system's inverter, which converts the solar power's DC current into usable AC electricity, finally fails. 3 years after People, the failed levees of Sacramento created a catastrophic flood on a scale matching Hurricane Katrina's destruction of New Orleans. But now, 10 years after People, an even greater wave of devastation looms. 20 miles away, the water level at Folsom Dam is dangerously high. Without People, the 1950s-era dam has accumulated silt and debris around the floodgate. The water is now about 400 feet higher in elevation than Sacramento. And a new winter storm is dumping water in faster than it can flow out.
If the dam overtopped, then as the water flowed around the sides of the dam, it would start eroding the abutments to the dam and could very likely result in a failure of the dam itself.
As the churning storm waters erode the earthen sides of the dam, they pull down the rest of the structure. The avalanche of water and debris soon reaches Sacramento.
The levees would be completely destroyed and overtopped. Water would flow through the entire city of Sacramento, and probably all infrastructure within the city would be completely destroyed.
At the airport, decaying planes are turned into projectiles, slamming into the surrounding buildings. But as water destroys some of man's cities, could this abandoned site in the middle of nowhere become the last surviving town on the planet? 10 years after People, water is taking a toll on empty coastal cities around the world, with a few exceptions. This mysterious town, abandoned 10 years ago, may reveal which cities will remain standing in a life after People. Of towns with more than a few hundred people, Pyramiden on the Norwegian island of Svalbard used to be the northernmost town on Earth. It's just 800 miles from the North Pole. Reaching this remote town requires an epic journey. A 4-hour flight north from Oslo. Then another 4 hours through the choppy, cold Arctic Sea. But for those adventurous enough to reach Pyramiden, the dangers don't end there. Any group going ashore must be armed with a rifle to fend off polar bear attacks.
You could get killed. The last year was 1995. Two different people got killed in two different locations. So they are potentially very, very dangerous.
500 miles north of the Norwegian mainland, between the chilling waves and sharp mountain peaks, lies the abandoned Cold War-era Soviet mining town.
I'm sitting in what was essentially the town square of a mining community. There were once about 1,400 people living here. This was, until 1998, an active coal mine. The Russians bought it from the Swedes in 1927, and they still own it. The mine is called the Pyramiden coal mine, or pyramids, because the mountain peaks around us take the shape of pyramids.
For the workers and their families, life in Pyramiden was one of structured isolation.
They had 6 days working week, and normally they had some days off. And I did that for 2 years. They eat at the mess hall. They got everything they needed here.
Beyond Lenin's gaze in the town square, the abandoned buildings sit frozen in time. There are no families to enter or leave the once crowded dormitories. No workers to use the industrial machinery. No one to use the sports equipment still standing in the gymnasium, next to the dry tile of the indoor pool. There's still coal in the mountains above Pyramiden, but retrieving it proved to be more trouble than it was worth.
People here left because it was no longer economically feasible to mine the coal. The coal mine itself, the seam of the coal, was way up near the top of those peaks, and it was a fairly thin seam of coal, so the Russians could not make a commercial business out of it and closed it down.
The empty buildings of Pyramiden are now waging their own Cold War for survival in the frigid Arctic climate. But there are certain advantages to being in the land of the polar bears. The Arctic temperatures are preserving the man-made structures here.
Basically, time slows down. Think of the food in your refrigerator. You put food in the freezer and its deterioration rate slows down. Doesn't stop, but it slows down greatly.
Even though Pyramiden is right by the shore, the low temperatures keep most of the moisture out of the air.
In a temperate climate, water gets into buildings, it then freezes, expands, cracks the building system, cracks the walls, cracks the bricks. It allows mold to grow, and then fungi, and then plants themselves. Here, that's going to happen over decades rather than over a few years. The buildings around me have not been occupied since 1998, but they're in almost perfect condition.
So how long will this abandoned mining village last? It's possible that someday Pyramiden could be known as the last town on Earth.
Even 200, 300, 400 years from now, this building will probably be recognizable as a building. And it would not be recognizable as a building in a temperate climate. It would literally be a little pile of rubble that an archaeologist, maybe coming from another planet, would have to dig through and find that there was once a building there.
But in far less than 200 years, the salty water and moist air of Sydney Harbour will unleash destructive forces hidden within one of the city's most famous landmarks. 50 years after People, the devastating waves of a winter storm are tearing into a crumbling Santa Monica Pier. The solar-powered Ferris wheel lighting system stopped working about 4 decades ago. And now, the rest of the rusting wheel is in trouble. Powerful waves and strong winds are wiping away most of the wheel. But the A-frame-shaped base remains. It's the same principle behind the incredible longevity of the Egyptian pyramids. A wide base and narrow top makes for an incredibly sturdy design.
Even if the first wheel left, that A-frame, I believe, would still be there for, I'd say, 100 years. It's such a stout structure. It's an A-frame. It's just very strong in that shape, a triangle.
Years after People. In Sydney Harbour, the Opera House is becoming unstable. Hundreds of feet above the crumbling pilings in the harbour, the moist, salty air has slowly eaten away at the building's signature shells. The iconic roof was built using an innovative technique that made the curved shape strong. It's a system known as precast, pre-stressed.
Cables are laid in a setting area, stretched as much as 6 inches over 100 feet. And as soon as the concrete has cured to the design strength, the cables are cut. And what happens, it's much like a rubber band. If you stretch it and let go, they want to snap back together.
But now, the stretching technique that gave the shells their strength is working against their survival.
It's a steel cable under pressure. It's going to snap. And as soon as one snaps, you're adding the pressure and the force from that area of the building to another area.
An entire shell quickly rips itself apart. As the crumbling shells slam down onto the main exposed to the salty water fail, and the rest of the structure collapses toward the harbor. One of the most iconic buildings in the world is headed down under. 100 years after People. Within sight of where the majestic Opera House once stood, the Sydney Harbour Bridge is nearing its own end. The aging steel is under tremendous stress. The hinges at each end of the arch once allowed the bridge to expand during the hot Australian days, but they became corroded and locked long ago. That pressure and severe corrosion could finally cause a cascade of crumbling supports. The bridge collapses into the harbor. 200 years after People. Inland sections of the Alaska pipeline have corroded slowly in this cold climate. Here, it takes more than rusting steel to open the pipeline. In the time of humans, the many elevated sections of pipeline and their supports were designed not only to withstand the elements, but also strong Alaskan earthquakes. 2 centuries later, the corroding structures are vulnerable.
I imagine you will get an earthquake, and the pipeline, if it's in the line of the earthquake, it's not going to survive. It's going to have cracks in it. And when the cracks occur, then you're going to spill everything out.
But because the pieces of pipeline are in one of the coldest parts of the world, away from the devastating effects of water, they may be some of the last remains of man.
I would say that's going to be one of the long-lasting artifacts that people left behind. I did a calculation. If you had a really low corrosion rate, many steel products would last over 2,000 years, 2,500 years. "500 years after People. Cities in temperate climates have virtually disappeared as they crumbled and became overgrown by plants and trees. But the abandoned mining town of Pyramiden, on a Norwegian island just 800 miles from the North Pole, is still recognizable. Due to the cold, dry climate, it's one of the best preserved towns on the planet. Unlike the many places where water has unleashed its destructive power. In the next episode, life after People takes to the skies. What secrets will emerge from the highest altitudes? Could a lack of air travel actually change the weather? What did NASA hope to prevent by destroying the space probe? And this apocalyptic place was meant to protect man from airborne Armageddon.